You've looked a little bit at doing a plot using R and doing a simple statistical test, and so here I'd like to work with a little bit more data and just show you a bit more of what the possibilities are of using R for different kinds of data analysis. So in this data here I have some analysis of moves done by Sarah, where we have different general moves like establishing a territory, and then you do that by claiming centrality, establishing niche, and so on. So here's a series of moves. These are in the introductions. And over here are some authors, and this first set kind of associated with American or America. And so you just sort of see the frequency of use of each author with respect to each of these moves. Okay, and so here are the American writers, and then over here are the Chinese writers. So you can kind of look at the data, and here are some totals for those for the Americans, and here are the totals for the Chinese, and you can see the kind of totals here at the bottom as well. So you could do different things with this data. I mean, you can try to find some of the differences in individual moves, or those moves which clearly distinguish the American writers from the Chinese writers. But I want to do something a little bit different, just to kind of explore the overall pattern of use of these different writers. And so what I'm going to do is going to transform this data into something that we can work with using some statistics. So here I've taken that data and just kind of simplified it in some sense. So here are the authors. I've just labeled them A1, A2, A3 for the Americans, and C1, C2, C3. I've kind of switched the axes around. And then up here, here are the different moves, so establishing a niche, these ones here, and so on. And I put in zeros where there's no use of that. So we can conceptually want to think about, well, here's A1, and this is kind of his profile of use of these different moves, and here's A2, and here's his profile. We could kind of think about comparing these two dimensions in this way, or these two lines. And or alternatively, we can say, well, here's move 101, and we can think about comparing that move, the profile of that move, in terms of use by these different writers, compared with, say, move 102 with this kind of profile. So you can think of this, looking at kind of multi-dimensional comparison, looking across at all the rows and looking down all the columns. So that's essentially what we want to try to do, to get some sense about how different these different writers are, and it's kind of hard to get a sense of that by looking at this data. I mean, is there a difference between the American writers and the Chinese writers? Just by kind of inspecting this data, you might see some differences, but it's kind of definitely hard to see. So I want to save this. I'm going to save this as a comma delimited table, and then load it into R. Here is my R interface, and I've loaded in that data structure, so we can just look at that. It's SJ2, so it's just looking the same as we saw before. One difference though is those numbers have been replaced by this variable, just numbered variables. So we'd have to kind of map back to 101 and 102 and so on for that. So I don't want to do a kind of statistical test like the prop test. I just want to kind of more visualize the data and see how different these individual writers are, and whether they group together, whether they cluster together. Say, looking at the data, it's pretty hard to see that. And so I've loaded the kind of package which has some functions in that I want. And I want to do a correspondence analysis, which does the kind of comparison I was talking about before. So let me just have a go at that and sort of say, well, let's call our variable sj dat, and it's going to be a correspondence analysis, and it's going to equal applying the correspondence analysis data or procedure to SJ2, and that gives us a result. It doesn't show the result, but we can look at that by doing summary Of course, you have to get the spelling right. So here, this shows a little bit of the summary. It's a little bit hard to analyze, but when you do this comparison of all these different columns and rows, you get this kind of multi-dimensional analysis of the connections or the correlation between the different parts. And so it's several dimensions, and what the procedure does is try to reduce those number of dimensions while still keeping track or keeping hold of the actual variation that's found. So when you look at all the dimensions, you kind of have the complete data, like 100% of the variation is accounted for, or 100% of the data is accounted for. But when you reduce the dimensions, you obviously lose some of that because we can't view multiple dimensions. So this shows us how much data we're capturing in different dimensions. So essentially, in the first dimension, the strongest dimension, we're capturing 90% of the variation, and the second dimension we're capturing another 19%, and the third dimension still quite high, 15%, and so it goes on. So this is showing you how much the variation is being captured by looking at these different numbers of dimensions. This is kind of a little bit complicated. This thing here is just showing us a few values. It's just giving an idea of how much contribution each of these variables make to distinguishing those writers. So we can see that the variable number 4 here is making a much larger contribution to distinguishing the writers than variable number 3. This is at least for this first factor, and for the second factor, actually variable 3 is making the high contribution. So it's kind of, that's why the kind of it's there being used. So you can see that you get some idea now of statistically what contribution these different moves are making to distinguishing the different authors. Well, that's very numeric, and we perhaps don't usually look at that. What we do next is try and give a plot, a kind of graphic representation of the data, which will be clearer. So here's the plot command, which looks a bit complicated, but it's quite straightforward. So it's just saying make a plot, draw a graph of this data, and just add the labels, A1, A2 for the rows, and the labels 101, 102 for the columns. So we just get our labels back. So let's try that. So now here's the plotted graph. Here, this is factor 1, the 20%, and here's factor 2, 20%. And so these are 2 dimensions, and then we can just see a couple of things here. We have the labels for the different writers, and in the red we have the labels for the different moves. So we can kind of see where they are in relation to the writers. So here's the 102. It's kind of quite clear to A1. So A1 is kind of, you think of the A1 as kind of pulling it this way, and C1 is kind of a weaker influence on that. It's not, if C1 was using a lot, it would be pulling this other way. So you can just see the relationship between the individual authors and the moves which are kind of mostly associated with them. So this gives you some idea, and you can maybe go back to the original raw data and check out these kind of relationships, which are becoming more clearer when you look at this graphic. I mean, obviously it's a complicated picture, but by looking at it and studying it, you have a chance to try to get to grips with this data, which I should say is preliminary, but I think it's interesting. And then looking at the writers, we do see a kind of cluster of the Chinese writers more in this quadrant, so their use of moves is tending to cluster the Chinese writers together. We do have one over here, and we have one over here. Okay, so there is a kind of clustering. There is a kind of difference, which is at least visible in these 2 dimensions as a result of this correspondence analysis. And perhaps another thing to note is that the American writers seem to be much more variable. They are the outliers. They're kind of more spread over a wider area, suggesting a more varied use of their moves compared with the Chinese. Now, this one is also a bit of an outlier, but generally you see this cluster here. So I think that's kind of helping us with our interpretation and dealing with the data. We're not giving a kind of statistical t-test or prop test, but we're seeing that there are some differences there, and we can be somewhat confident about giving this graph in a paper or talking about these differences and showing people that there is something going on here. So the multiple dimensions of the comparison have been reduced here to the 2 dimensions, and are showing us, I say, about 40% of the variation. But if you remember when we looked at those eigenvalues, that the 3rd dimension was also quite high, 15%, and so it'd be quite nice to look at that 3rd dimension to see what difference that makes to the distribution of the authors. So I need to switch and use a different correspondence analysis of a procedure. This is called CA, and again it's just applied to the basic data structure. I'm going to put the results into this variable, and we can try maybe just typing that. See if that gives us the data. So again, we're getting this similar kind of very complicated looking picture that we got before. So here's 90%, 90%, 15%, and so on, and some various other technical things which I'm not sure how to interpret. So I'm going to plot that data again and have a look at the results. So the plot looks a little bit different, but here's pretty much the same as we had last time, where here's the kind of cluster of the Chinese writers and the outlier here, and then some more variation in the American writers. But now we can move this because we have 3 dimensions here. So if we move it on the 3rd dimension, then we see some kind of we can see some kind of separation of the Chinese writers along that, but still kind of closely clustered, and we see the another view of the American writers, maybe in a more coherent space on this view, although again with the outliers. So this kind of, we can just inspect, how these different writers are distributed within this 3-dimensional space. I've taken away the labels just so it's clearer for this kind of demonstration. But I think this is kind of a good way to explore the data and shows the usefulness perhaps of using R to examine the data and see what kind of patterns you can find in it.